The cold wind of the western frontier howled across the open land as a lone stagecoach rattled toward a small settlement. Inside sat a woman wrapped tightly in a faded shawl. Her name was Clara Boone, and she had been traveling for days through the endless snow. The other passengers had stopped talking to her long ago. They had sensed what others always did, that she was different, that she carried a quiet sadness she didn't explain. When the coach finally stopped near the trading post, Clara stepped down slowly, her boots sinking into the frozen mud. The driver tipped his hat and wished her luck, though his tone carried more pity than kindness. Clara stood there for a moment, clutching her small trunk, watching as the stagecoach disappeared into the white horizon. She was alone again, a stranger in yet another town. The settlement was small, barely a handful of wooden buildings lined along a narrow road. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the faint sound of a hammer striking metal came from the blacksmith shed. A few men near the saloon glanced at her, their eyes curious but cold. She kept walking, her face hidden under the edge of her bonnet. She had learned to move as if she didn't hear the whispers. At the general store, she asked if there was a place she could rent for a few nights. The storekeeper's wife frowned and said the rooms were full. Clara tried the inn next, but the innkeeper's wife folded her arms and said sharply, "We don't take in single ladies traveling alone. Brings talk." The words stung like ice against her skin. Clara thanked her softly and stepped back out into the cold. The snow began falling again, thick and heavy. She walked down the main street, her shawl soaked through, her hands trembling from the cold. Her boots left faint prints in the new snow, prints that the wind tried to erase. She didn't know where to go next. There was no family waiting for her, no friend to call her name. Only the white silence of the frontier stretched before her. As darkness crept over the land, a lantern's glow caught her eye. A small cabin standing apart from the rest of the town, near a frozen stream. The light flickered through the frosted window like a quiet invitation. She hesitated, unsure if she should approach, but the wind grew sharper, biting her cheeks and fingers. She had no choice. When she reached the door, she knocked softly. For a moment, there was no answer. Then footsteps approached, and the door opened a few inches. A tall man stood there, his beard covered in frost, eyes cautious yet calm. "Evening," he said simply. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice weak from the cold. "I only need a place to stay until morning. I'll leave as soon as the storm clears." The man looked at her carefully. He was not a man used to company. His name was Eli Turner, a ranch hand who had chosen solitude after too many losses. He had seen how people in town treated outsiders, and something about this woman's trembling hands and weary eyes stirred his conscience. "It's no hotel," he said finally, stepping aside. "But it's warm enough." Clara nodded gratefully and stepped inside. The small cabin was simple. One table, one chair, a narrow bed against the wall, and a wood stove glowing faintly. She could smell the faint scent of burning pine and old leather. Eli closed the door behind her, shutting out the freezing wind. "You can sit by the fire," he said quietly. She moved closer to the warmth, rubbing her hands together, feeling the blood return to her fingers. The fire cracked softly, filling the silence. Eli watched her from across the room, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to sharing his space with anyone, especially a stranger. But there was something about the calm dignity in her posture that kept him from asking too many questions. After a long silence, he handed her a tin mug filled with hot coffee. She accepted it with both hands, whispering, "Thank you." "You heading somewhere?" he asked. She gave a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just west, as far as the road will take me," he nodded. "Not many folks travel in weather like this." "I didn't have much choice," she replied softly. He didn't press further. They sat in silence, listening to the wind push against the cabin walls. After a while, Eli stood, adding more wood to the stove. "You can take the bed tonight," he said quietly. "I'll stay by the fire." Clara shook her head quickly. "No, I can sleep near the stove. I'm already grateful for the roof over my head." Eli frowned slightly but didn't argue. He laid out an extra blanket on the floor near the fire. Clara settled down, her body exhausted from days of travel. The heat from the stove filled the small room, and soon the sound of the storm outside faded into a dull hum. But Eli couldn't sleep. He kept glancing at her, the way her face softened in the firelight, the way her hands were still clasped together as if in prayer. Something about her presence unsettled him, yet also made the cabin feel less empty. When dawn came, the snow had buried the world outside. The windows were rimmed with frost and the door was nearly frozen shut. Clara woke to find Eli already tending the fire. "Looks like we're snowed in," he said almost apologetically. She looked out the window, her breath fogging the glass. The white world outside was silent and endless. For the first time she felt a strange peace, as if the storm had given her a reason to stop running, even if only for a while. Eli handed her a bowl of oatmeal and said, "Not much, but it'll warm you." She smiled, her eyes soft. "It's more than I've had in days." As she ate, Eli studied her quietly. He had heard the gossip in town, that a woman had arrived from back east alone, unwanted, and carrying shame she didn't deserve. Looking at her now, he saw no shame, only strength, quiet and steady. Outside, the snow kept falling and the wind sang across the frozen fields. Inside, two strangers sat near a fire, each carrying their own pain, neither knowing that this night would mark the beginning of something that would change both their lives. That evening, as the sky darkened again, Clara folded her shawl and said softly, "I'll help with the chores tomorrow, if you'll let me." Eli looked up from the stove, surprised. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. "I can't sit here while you work alone." "It's not right," he nodded slowly. There was honesty in her words, not the kind that demanded trust, but the kind that earned it quietly. Later that night, when he banked the fire and prepared to sleep, he caught a final glimpse of her sitting near the window, watching the snow fall. She seemed both fragile and unbreakable, a woman who had been through storms far worse than the one outside. Eli didn't know her story yet, but he sensed that beneath the layers of silence, there was a reason she had ended up at his door that night, a reason that would unfold slowly, like the thaw of spring after a long, cold winter. And as the wind whispered through the cracks of the old cabin, both of them, without saying a word, began to understand that fate had brought them together for more than just shelter. It was the start of something neither had dared to hope for again, warmth in the middle of a frozen world. The next morning, when Clara opened her eyes, she saw sunlight struggling through the frost-covered window. The storm had ended, but the world outside was buried under thick snow. The door creaked in the wind, and she could hear the wood stove crackling as Eli added more logs to keep the small cabin warm. For the first time in many nights, she had slept without fear of being out in the cold. Eli looked over his shoulder when he noticed her awake. "Morning," he said simply. His deep voice broke the stillness. Clara nodded, still wrapped in the blanket, her hair loose and messy. She smiled faintly. "Morning," she replied softly. The room smelled of coffee and smoke. On the small table there were 2 tin mugs and a pot of stew warming slowly. "You must be hungry," Eli said, handing her a mug of coffee. She accepted it with both hands, letting the warmth seep through her fingers. "Thank you," she said. They ate quietly. The sound of spoons tapping the bowls was the only noise. The storm had trapped them both inside. The snow was high enough that even opening the door seemed useless. "We'll be stuck here for a few days," Eli said finally, glancing at the window. The road to town's covered deep. No one's getting in or out. Clara looked down at her bowl, then nodded slowly. "Then I'll make myself useful." Eli raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said more firmly this time. "I can cook, mend clothes, clean. I won't sit idle while you work." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. "All right." That afternoon she began to clean the cabin. She swept the wooden floor, folded the few blankets, and even mended a torn sleeve of Eli's shirt she found near the bed. Eli didn't say much, but every now and then he caught himself watching her. There was grace in the way she moved, quiet but purposeful. She didn't complain, didn't ask for anything. Outside, the snow glistened under the pale sun. Inside, the cabin felt more alive than it had in months. As evening came, the temperature dropped again. The wind picked up, pressing against the windows. Eli stacked more wood near the stove, but even that couldn't stop the cold from creeping in through the cracks. Clara rubbed her hands together, trying to stay warm. Her lips trembled slightly, Eli noticed. "The fire's not keeping up," he said, frowning. He placed another log in, sparks flying up the chimney. The cabin groaned as if the cold itself had weight. Clara sat near the stove, her hands stretched toward the little warmth it gave. "It feels colder than last night," she said quietly. "It is," he replied. "It'll be a bad one." He moved around the room, checking the walls for drafts, stuffing small rags into gaps. The effort didn't help much. The air grew icy and his breath turned into mist. Hours passed. They both stayed near the fire, their faces pale from the chill. Eli rubbed his arms, trying to shake off the cold. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, but her teeth still chattered softly. Finally, Eli sighed. "We might have to move closer to the stove," he said. Clara nodded, but it didn't help much. The wood was burning faster than he could replace it. The cabin was simply too small, too thin to fight the frontier cold. Then, in the middle of the night, when the fire was nearly out, Clara looked up at him. Her voice was calm but steady. "Eli," she said. He turned toward her. "It's too cold," she said firmly. "We must share one bed." He froze, unsure what to say. Her tone wasn't suggestive. It was practical, almost commanding, like a woman who had made up her mind. "If we don't," she continued softly, "we might not see morning." Eli hesitated. He had lived alone for years, always careful, always distant. The idea of sharing his bed with a woman, a stranger, felt strange and heavy. But when he looked at her, he didn't see scandal or danger. He saw someone exhausted, someone trembling from cold, someone who simply wanted to live through the night. He nodded once. "All right." Without another word, he spread the thickest quilt over the bed and made sure there was space enough for both. He turned away as she walked to the bed and lay down quietly, still wrapped in her shawl. He lay down next to her, careful to keep a respectful distance. The wind roared outside, rattling the door. Inside, the silence felt fragile. For a while, neither of them moved. Then Clara whispered, her voice barely above the sound of the storm. "Thank you." Eli turned slightly toward her. "You don't need to thank me. It's the only way." "I know," she said, staring at the ceiling. "Still thank you." Minutes turned into hours. The cold still pressed against them, so Clara shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter. Her shoulder brushed against his arm. He didn't move. Slowly, the warmth between them began to spread under the covers, enough to soften the edge of the freezing air. They lay there quietly, two lonely souls who had never asked life for much, only a little peace, a little warmth. As the night deepened, Clara found herself remembering her past. The big house she had once lived in back east. The parties, the piano, the polite smiles that hid cruelty. Her husband had been respected yet unkind. When she finally left him, she had been cast out as though she were the sinner. She had traveled west hoping to start over, but even here, judgment had followed her like a shadow. Now, lying in a stranger's cabin on a frozen night, she realized this was the first time in years that she felt safe. Eli, too, lay awake, staring into the dark. He thought about his younger brother, who had died in a mining accident years ago, a loss he blamed himself for. Since then, he had chosen a quiet life, away from people, away from talk. Yet somehow this quiet woman had found her way to his door, as if fate itself had sent her. After a long silence, Clara spoke softly. "Do you always live alone?" Eli nodded in the dark. "Yes, suits me fine. Don't you ever get lonely?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes. But loneliness is better than disappointment." Clara nodded faintly. "I understand that." Their voices fell quiet again. Outside, the wind screamed, snow pounding against the walls. But inside, the sound of two steady breaths began to fill the space. As the hours passed, Eli drifted into a light sleep. He woke once when he felt Clara's hand brush against his arm, just for warmth. He didn't move away. He simply let it be. There was something innocent, something deeply human about it. Two people surviving the cold together. By the time dawn arrived, the storm had finally passed. The first light of morning spilled into the cabin, touching the wooden walls with soft gold. Clara stirred beside him and opened her eyes. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw Eli sitting by the stove, feeding the fire. "Morning," he said quietly, without looking at her. "Morning," she replied, sitting up slowly. Her face was pale, but there was a new calmness in her expression. The fear that had followed her for so long seemed lighter now. Eli handed her a cup of warm water. "We made it through the night," he said. She smiled faintly. "Thanks to your fire," he shook his head. "Thanks to your courage," he said softly. Not everyone would knock on a stranger's door in a storm. Clara looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "Sometimes," she said, When you've lost everything, the only thing left to fear is dying alone. Eli didn't reply, but something in his heart stirred at her words, a deep understanding that neither of them had spoken before. The day passed quietly. They cleared some snow from the door and watched the frozen world outside. The storm had changed everything, the land, the silence, and something within them both. Though they didn't say it out loud, they knew their fates had crossed for a reason. That night, when the cold returned, Clara looked at him again and smiled faintly. "It's too cold again," she said softly, almost teasing this time. Eli smiled too, the first real smile in a long, long time. Then he said, nodding toward the bed, "We'd better do what worked." And just like that, two lonely hearts, once strangers, began to find warmth, not just against the cold, but within each other's quiet company. The storm finally ended after 3 long days. When Clara stepped outside, she could hardly recognize the land around the cabin. Everything was covered in white. Fences, trees, even the path to the stream had disappeared under a deep blanket of snow. The sky was calm now, painted in soft blue and gold as the sun broke through the clouds. The world was quiet, almost peaceful. She stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cold air. For the first time in years, she felt her heart beating steady and strong. The storm hadn't broken her. It had somehow made her feel alive again. Inside the cabin, she heard Eli moving around, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He appeared at the doorway and said, "You shouldn't stand out too long." The snow's still sharp. Clara smiled faintly. "After all that time trapped inside, it feels good to breathe." He nodded and stepped aside so she could come in. The fire was burning again and the cabin was warm. She placed her gloves near the stove to dry and sat at the table. Eli poured 2 mugs of coffee, the smell filling the small space. They sat quietly for a while, listening to the soft hiss of the fire. It was Clara who finally broke the silence. "You've been kind to me, Eli. You didn't have to be." Eli looked up, his expression calm. "You needed help. I just did what anyone decent would." She smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. "Not everyone's decent anymore." Eli didn't reply. He knew she was right. Out here on the frontier, kindness was rare. Survival made people hard, suspicious, and cold. He could see that Clara had met her share of cold hearts before. After a pause, she said softly, "You must wonder why I came out here alone." "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," Eli said. She looked into the fire, her fingers curling around the warm mug. "I suppose I am ready," she said quietly. "There's not much left to hide." She took a deep breath and began her story. "I was married once," she said slowly. "Back east. My husband was a banker, respected, well-dressed, always smiling in public. People thought we were lucky, but inside our home things were different." Eli stayed silent, letting her speak. "He was a man who liked control," she continued, her voice calm but heavy. "Every word I said, every friend I spoke to, every letter I sent, he needed to see it. He didn't hit, but his words could wound deeper than any whip. When he said I was worthless, I believed him for years." The firelight flickered across her face as she spoke. "One day I found out he had been lying to everyone, cheating, stealing, hurting people behind their backs. I tried to stop him, but instead he turned the whole town against me. Said I was unstable, said I brought shame to his name." Her eyes lowered. "When I left him, the church turned its doors on me. The neighbors looked away. I packed my things and went west, hoping maybe the land would forget what people wouldn't." Eli listened quietly. He didn't interrupt, didn't pity her. He simply nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. After a long silence, he said, "You didn't deserve any of that." Clara gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe not, but I've learned that life doesn't always give what's deserved." Eli stared into the fire, his hands folded together. "You sound stronger than you think." She tilted her head. "Do I?" He nodded. "Most folks would have stopped trying after that. You're still standing." Clara looked at him for a moment, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her eyes softened completely. "I suppose I had to be strong," she said quietly. "There was no one else to depend on." Eli gave a faint smile. "Sometimes that's the only way to keep going." A quiet moment passed between them, a calm, warm silence that felt different from the lonely quiet they'd known before. After a while, Clara asked gently, "And you, Eli? You live alone out here. Why?" He hesitated, rubbing the edge of his coffee mug. Because I learned early that the world takes what you love if you let it. She watched him carefully. What did it take from you? He stared into the fire before answering. My brother. We worked together in the mines years ago. There was a cave-in. I told him to go down one more shift. He never came back up. Clara's breath caught. Oh, Eli. He shook his head. Nothing I could have done after that would change it. So I came here. Far enough from the mines. Far enough from everyone who remembered. The room grew quiet again. The kind of silence that didn't hurt this time. It was the silence of understanding. Two broken lives finding peace in the company of another who understood pain. Later that afternoon, Clara began to hum softly while sewing a tear in her skirt. The gentle sound filled the room like sunlight. Eli paused his work chopping wood to listen. It had been years since music had touched his cabin. He said softly, "That's a fine tune." She smiled. "It's something my mother used to sing. She said it keeps the heart from freezing in winter." "I reckon it works," he said. And she laughed quietly as evening came. They shared supper together, a simple stew with cornbread. It wasn't much, but Clara said it was the best meal she'd had in months. After eating, they sat by the fire again. Eli began carving a small piece of wood, while Clara mended an old pair of mittens she found in his chest. The glow of the fire made the cabin feel warmer than it really was. Then Eli spoke suddenly, his voice thoughtful. "You know, Clara, you can stay here till the road's open. There's no need to rush back into that world that never treated you fair." She looked at him with surprise, then smiled softly. "That's kind of you, but I wouldn't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said simply. "You make this place feel less empty." The words hung in the air like a soft promise. Clara's eyes shimmered in the firelight, though she said nothing. That night, as they prepared to sleep, Clara hesitated near the bed. "Eli," she said quietly, "you've shown more kindness than anyone has in a long time. I won't forget that." He looked up from tending the fire. "Don't thank me, Clara, you've done just as much. You've reminded me that life doesn't end just because it hurts." For a moment they looked at each other, two souls who had walked through different storms and ended up under the same roof. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something deeper and simpler. Trust. As the wind outside softened into a calm hush, Eli blew out the lantern. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Eli," she whispered back. But neither of them slept easily that night. Both lay awake for a while, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire. Each thought about how strange fate was, how it could bring two lost people together in the middle of nowhere. Not by plan, but by need, and somewhere in the stillness, both began to feel that this storm, instead of breaking them, had brought them the chance to heal. The next morning, the sun was brighter, and a thin layer of mist rose from the snow outside. Clara opened the window for the first time, letting in the sharp, fresh air. Eli stood beside her, watching the horizon. "Looks like spring's not far off," he said. "Maybe," Clara said with a small smile. "Maybe things do change after all." Eli nodded slowly. "They do. Sometimes it just takes one person to remind you it's still possible." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "Then I'm glad I knocked on your door that night." He smiled faintly. "So am I." And as the morning light filled the cabin, the two of them stood there, not as strangers anymore, but as survivors who had finally found warmth after years of cold. When the snow finally began to melt, the valley turned from white to brown. The roads opened again, and travelers started coming through the settlement once more. Clara watched from the cabin window as wagons rolled past on the far road, their wheels splashing through the mud. Life was slowly returning to normal after the long winter. But normal was something Clara wasn't sure she wanted anymore. She had grown used to the quiet rhythm of Eli's cabin, the sound of chopping wood, the smell of coffee each morning, the slow evenings by the fire. It had become a kind of peace she hadn't known for years. But peace doesn't always last on the frontier. Word travels faster than wagons, and rumors move quicker than the wind. One morning, Eli saddled his horse and told Clara he needed to ride into town for supplies. "You should stay inside," he said gently. The ground still soft and slick. Clara nodded, though she secretly wanted to walk with him. She hadn't seen anyone from town since that night she arrived in the storm. Eli was gone for hours. When he returned at dusk, his face was hard and unreadable. He dropped a sack of flour and beans on the table without a word. Clara looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. "You look troubled," she said softly. He sighed, sitting down heavily. "People in town have been talking." "About me?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. He nodded. "They say things that aren't true. They think you and I—" He stopped, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter what they think. They don't know what really happened." Clara wiped her hands and sat across from him. "It always matters, Eli. Out here, talk can ruin someone faster than a storm." He looked at her, anger flickering behind his calm eyes. "You did nothing wrong. You were freezing and needed a place to stay. That's all anyone needs to know." "But they won't see it that way," she said softly. "They never do." For a while, they both sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle. Outside, a light rain began to fall, washing away the last of the snow. Clara thought of all the places she had run from before, all the whispers that followed her from one town to another. It seemed that no matter where she went, someone always found a way to twist her story. The next morning, she decided to go into town herself. She dressed in her plainest dress, tied her hair neatly, and stepped out before Eli could stop her. When he came out of the barn and saw her walking down the trail, he called after her, but she didn't turn around. She needed to face them, the whispers, the stares, all of it. When Clara reached the town's main street, people stopped to look. The blacksmith paused mid-swing. The storekeeper's wife whispered to a neighbor, and a group of men outside the saloon watched silently. Clara kept her head high. She went straight into the general store to buy flour and soap. Inside, the storekeeper avoided her eyes. His wife gave her a tight smile. "Well, I'll be," the woman said. "Didn't think we'd see you again after that blizzard." Clara set her coins on the counter. "The storm kept me at Eli Turner's cabin. He saved my life." The woman's eyebrows lifted. "I'm sure he did," she said in a tone dripping with suggestion. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't let anger show. "You should thank him too. Not many men would risk freezing for a stranger." The woman didn't answer. She packed the supplies in silence, her lips pressed thin. When Clara stepped outside, she could feel every pair of eyes following her down the street. On her way back, she passed the small church. The preacher stood near the door, sweeping the steps. When he saw her, he hesitated, then nodded politely. "Miss Boone," he said, "glad to see you survived the winter." "By God's mercy and a kind man's help," she replied. He studied her for a moment. "People talk, Miss Boone. You know how towns can be. But truth has a way of lasting longer than gossip." Clara met his gaze. "Then I'll keep living honestly, and let time speak for me." That evening, when she returned to the cabin, Eli was waiting outside. He looked both relieved and worried. "You shouldn't have gone alone," he said quietly. "I had to," she replied. "I won't hide from anyone." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You've got more courage than most men I know." They went inside. The rain had stopped, and the sunset painted the room in gold and pink light. Clara placed the flour on the shelf and turned to him. "I'm sorry if my being here causes you trouble, Eli." He shook his head. "You've brought no trouble. You've brought company. You've brought life." For a moment they stood close, the air warm between them. Then Clara looked away, her hands trembling slightly. "You're kind, Eli. Too kind for the way this world talks." He took a slow step closer. "Let them talk. They don't live our lives. They don't know what happened here. Let them say what they want." Clara smiled faintly but didn't answer. The warmth in his voice both comforted and scared her. She wasn't ready to belong to anyone again, not after all the hurt she had carried. That night, when Eli banked the fire, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat near the window, watching the moonlight spill over the hills. The sound of the stream outside had returned, a sure sign that spring was near. But with spring came choices, and she didn't know yet what she would do. The next few days passed quietly. They worked side by side, clearing the snow from the path and mending the fence. Sometimes Eli would talk about the ranch he once worked on, or about the wild horses that roamed the plains. Clara listened, her eyes bright with interest. In return, she told him small things from her life. How she used to read by candlelight, how she loved roses but never had a garden of her own. Each story, each shared silence drew them closer. Yet neither spoke the words that hung between them. Then one afternoon, Eli rode to town again. When he came back, he was quiet. That evening, as they ate supper, he finally said, "I heard more talk today. Some folks think I should have turned you away." Clara looked down. They want us both to live like the cold did. Heartless. Eli looked up, his eyes steady. I don't care what they want. I know what's right. The next morning, Clara packed her small trunk. Eli found her standing by the door, her shawl around her shoulders. You're leaving? He asked, his voice low. She nodded slowly. I've brought you enough trouble, Eli. I can't let my presence make your life harder. He stepped forward. You're not trouble. I am to them, she said gently, and I can't make you choose between peace and kindness. He looked at her for a long time, then said softly, Clara, this cabin was empty long before you came. You filled it with light. You made me remember how it feels to care. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't want to lose that light for you. Then stay, he said simply. Let them say what they want. We'll build our own peace. Clara hesitated. The way he said it, calm, honest, certain, touched something deep inside her. She looked around the cabin, at the firelight dancing across the walls, at the table they had shared, the chair she had mended, the warmth that felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever been. Finally, she let the trunk fall to the floor. I don't know what tomorrow brings, Eli, she whispered. He stepped closer. Then we'll face it together. A soft smile spread across her face. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds parted, revealing the first stars of the evening. Inside, the small cabin glowed with the kind of peace that comes after storms. Quiet, steady, real. From that night on, Clara stayed. She didn't hide when she went into town anymore. She held her head high and met every gaze with calm strength. Slowly, the whispers faded, replaced by something new. Respect. People began to see what Eli had seen from the start. A woman who had faced the coldest winds and still found warmth to give. And sometimes, when the night grew cold again, Clara would smile at Eli and say softly, Too cold. We must share one bed. It would make him laugh quietly every time. And together they would face whatever storm life sent their way. The long winter had passed and spring finally reached the frontier. The frozen streams began to sing again and the scent of wet soil filled the air. The land, once covered in snow, turned alive with wildflowers and tall grass. The sun shone brighter now, soft and golden, bringing warmth to everything it touched. Clara stood outside the cabin, hanging freshly washed clothes on a rope between two trees. The breeze carried the smell of pine and blooming sage. Her cheeks had color again and there was a quiet peace in her eyes. She hummed softly to herself, a tune Eli had grown to love hearing in the mornings. Inside, Eli was fixing a loose board near the stove. The small cabin looked different now. There were curtains Clara had sewn by hand, a vase filled with wildflowers on the table, and a woven rug she had made from old cloth strips. What once felt like a shelter for one lonely man now felt like a home for two hearts that had found comfort in each other's company. When Clara came back inside, Eli looked up and smiled. You've made this place look finer than any ranch house I've ever seen, he said. She laughed softly. It's not much, Eli, but it's honest. And it's warm. He nodded. Warm, that's what matters. They sat at the table together. Eli poured her a cup of coffee and watched her quietly for a moment. There was something different about her now. Not just the color in her face or the strength in her hands, but the calm way she carried herself. The woman who had once arrived trembling and cold now moved with quiet confidence. As they ate, Eli said, I've been thinking, maybe we could plant something out back this year. The soil's good. You'd get your garden at last. Clara's face lit up with a smile. A garden? Why not? You said once you loved roses. Maybe they'd like it here. She looked out the window, imagining flowers blooming beside the cabin. I'd like that, she said softly. Something beautiful to tend, something that grows because we care for it. Eli smiled. That sounds like us. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding, full of shared warmth. Over the next few weeks, they worked side by side. Eli plowed the small patch of land behind the cabin, and Clara planted seeds she had traded for in town, beans, potatoes, and a few rose cuttings that the preacher's wife had given her, after finally warming up to her. Each day, the neighbors began to see something new in Clara. The same people who once whispered now greeted her kindly when she passed by. Children smiled and waved when she came into town with bread or wildflowers in her hands. It wasn't quick, but slowly the talk changed. People began to say that maybe they had judged her too harshly, that maybe she wasn't the woman they had imagined. One Sunday afternoon, the preacher held a small service outdoors since the church roof was being repaired. Everyone gathered near the river, and Eli and Clara stood at the back, side by side. The preacher's words were simple, about forgiveness and new beginnings. When he spoke about grace finding its way to those who had suffered long, Clara felt tears fill her eyes. After the service, several townsfolk came to greet them. The storekeeper's wife, the same woman who had once looked at her with cold suspicion, smiled awkwardly and said, "Miss Boone, your bread at the fair last week was the best I've tasted in years." Clara smiled kindly. "Thank you. You can call me Clara." Eli watched quietly, pride in his eyes. He knew how much it had taken for her to stand tall in front of the same people who once turned their backs. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, they walked home together. The sky was painted with colors of orange and pink, and a warm wind brushed through the tall grass. Clara stopped near the fence line, watching the light fade over the horizon. "It's strange," she said softly. "A year ago I thought my life was over. Everything I'd built was gone, and now it feels like it's only beginning." Eli looked at her, his expression gentle. "Sometimes you have to lose everything before you can see what truly matters." She turned toward him, smiling. "And what matters, Eli?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "This right here. The peace, the fire in the evenings. You." Her eyes softened, and she felt her heart beat faster, though his voice had been simple and calm. They reached the cabin just as the first stars began to appear. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Clara lit a small oil lamp and placed it on the table. The warm glow touched their faces, making the little cabin feel even more like home. Eli took something from his pocket, a small wooden ring he had carved himself. The wood was smooth, the color rich and deep. He placed it on the table in front of her. "I don't have gold or fancy things," he said quietly, "but I carved this for you, Clara, because this place, this life, it's not mine alone anymore. It's ours." Clara stared at the ring, her eyes shimmering. "Eli," she whispered. He looked at her with steady eyes. "You don't have to say yes to anything. I just want you to know, you'll never have to face another storm alone again." Her lips trembled as she smiled. "It's beautiful," she said softly, picking up the ring. "You made it yourself," he nodded. "Every bit of it. Took me weeks, but it kept my hands busy thinking about you." Tears filled her eyes as she slid the ring onto her finger. "You gave me a home, Eli. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to stay." He smiled, his voice low. "Then stay, for as long as the world lets us." That night they sat by the fire, their hands resting close together on the table. Outside, the crickets sang, and the smell of wild roses drifted through the open window. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge from a storm. It was a home built on kindness, trust, and quiet love. Seasons passed. The garden flourished. The small patch of earth behind their cabin filled with green vines and bright flowers. The roses, delicate but strong, bloomed beside the fence, Clara's favorite. People began to visit the cabin for her bread, her herbs, and her gentle advice. Some even asked her to teach their daughters how to sow or plant. She became part of the town, not as an outcast, but as someone people admired. Eli often stood by the door, watching her laugh with the children or share stories with the women who once whispered behind her back. He would smile to himself, proud and grateful. Years later, when another harsh winter came, Eli and Clara sat by the fire as they had that first night. The snow piled outside and the wind howled, but inside the warmth held steady. Clara looked at him and smiled playfully. "Too cold again, Eli. We must share one bed." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I reckon we've been sharing it long enough that you don't have to ask anymore." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Still, I like to remind you," she said with a smile. Eli looked down at her, his eyes filled with the same gentle affection that had grown through all the storms and seasons. "And I like to hear it," he said quietly. The fire flickered softly, and the cabin glowed with the light of two lives that had found warmth against every cold wind the world had sent their way. Outside, the land lay still under the snow, but inside, there was only peace, the peace of two hearts that had learned together that sometimes even the harshest winters can lead to the warmest springs. And every year when the snow began to fall again, Clara would smile, brush her hand against his, and whisper those same words with a glint of mischief and love in her eyes. Too cold. Eli, we must share one bed. Eli would laugh quietly, pull her closer, and together they would face another winter, knowing that no matter how hard the storm blew, they would always have warmth, the kind that never faded even when the fire turned to embers.